we'll start off with Dorivar Ruiz Diaz talking about soil fertility. He's got a graduate student as well. Then we'll go to Sarah Lancaster with cover crops and soybeans. And finally, Rodrigo Onofre and his crew will finish up, and that'll be our program. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dorivar.
Okay, good afternoon. It's good to have a nice weather finally, especially some rain. A little bit late for some corn and soybean, but very glad to be here. As Scott mentioned, my name is Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, soil fertility specialist. For those of you who don't know me, we just give out some handouts there, and we have a few things I would like to discuss today in the time we have. Obviously, a lot of focus really on fertilizer prices, right, and how we can be more efficient. Is there any room there to improve efficiency and get the most that we can get from fertilizer that we apply? Fertilizer prices obviously still high, and it's unfortunately, I don't know what the outlook is there for prices. Hopefully, it will just come down, right? But anyways, from the agronomic standpoint, there are a few things that we can keep in mind to improve efficiency, and those are the main things I would like to discuss. If you have any questions, comments, we have a small group. I think it would be good to ask questions. Anything that you see, maybe things that you were seeing this year with your programs, please share. I think that's the best thing really of these field days is really that discussion and the experience that you're seeing here. Pedro is with me. He's a master's student. Also, he's working on a nitrogen project. He's going to share a little bit here on part of the data that he collected last year here in Scandia and Belleville, basically an ongoing project. So one of the things I wanted to kind of start on that first page that you have there, one of the first step that we always talk about in soil fertility, soil testing, right? So we're always saying that, soil testing, we need to pay attention to that. And I think we've done a lot of, we know pretty much what we need to do, how to collect the samples. I think it's very important to keep an eye on that and make sure we are getting good quality samples. But one thing that I got this year, this spring, this was for wheat planted last fall. Somebody collected samples for profile nitrogen, and analysis came back. It was over 100 pounds of nitrogen. And so basically, this person didn't apply much nitrogen, and there was some nitrogen deficiency showing up. And so we start wondering, okay, what's going on? What's the problem with that field? It's a soil test. And so we start asking questions, how do you handle this sample after you collect it in the field? And it turns out that he was keeping that sample in the pickup for a few days there. And so the question was, okay, how much effect you can have on nitrogen if you do that with your soil sample? And so we did basically a small experiment here in that page number 1, you can see there. Essentially, this is Brian Reuter, another of my students, and he basically collect a set of samples. One set of the samples basically put it in storage. Basically what we will do is a cold room in the lab where we keep the sample. That would be the recommended storage, and another one he keep it in his pickup basically for 2 weeks. Okay, and so what you see there in that page, figure number 1, especially if you look at nitrate, the blue purple dots is the samples that basically stay in the pickup for almost 2 weeks. Okay. You can see the difference compared to the sample that was stored in the cold room, which what we will do in the lab. And essentially, to make the story there, just to look at the kind of the take-home points there in the bottom, we basically end up with over 100 pounds of nitrogen difference by leaving that sample there sitting in the pickup compared to the sample that you store correctly in the cold room. So what happens there? What happens to that sample and that nitrogen? What happens to nitrogen when you have moist and warm conditions? Where is that nitrogen coming from? What is the type of nitrogen we have in the soil? We have nitrates, right, which is immediately available. What else?
Yeah, organic matter.
Yeah.
Basically, you summer ball it in your pickup.
Exactly. You basically speeding up that incubation, essentially what we do, right? a lot of that organic nitrogen and organic matter is breaking down, coming into the nitrate. And it's showing us something that's not real, right? Because that what we do with the profile nitrate is that we're trying to find out how much nitrate we have left from the previous crop, right? But essentially, by leaving that pickup, we basically speed up that process. A lot of that organic matter breakdown, and that's what's showing up, which is not real, right? And so that's one something to keep in mind. I think it's a kind of an interesting example of how extreme that difference can be if we are not handling the sample correctly. Now, these open other questions. Okay, what happens if we are, collecting the samples and put it in the mail? How long you think it takes to get to the lab? Any guess? 3 days. Yeah, that's what I usually hear. A couple of days. Anymore, in some cases, is overnight. Also, UPS will kind of get it overnight. 3 days, if you think about 3 days, is that a problem? And if you look at here, in a couple of 2-3 days, there was a difference, but really not much. Really start to pick up when you're living there for about a week or so. Okay, so it's really an extreme situation. So I don't worry about, the times a couple of days are taken in the mail. To me, that's not a problem. Okay, but you will be surprised. Very often we see this in the soil testing lab. Collect the sample, leave it in the pickup, finally made it to Manhattan and drop it off in the lab, and you start to see some issues there. What other nutrients you think, we know these are microbial driven process, right? What other nutrients you think would be a concern? Besides nitrogen? Sulfur, right? Exactly, and that's what we saw here a little bit. Actually, I was surprised not so much in the case of sulfur in this set of samples. Brian collected another set of samples, and actually in that particular case, sulfur was also the same situation. Sulfur is just like nitrogen, very much like nitrogen, microbial driven process coming from organic matter, and you start to see the same problem. So exactly right, that's the other one. And in this sample, you can see there's a little bit of an effect on sulfur. Not so much on other things, iron, zinc, other things really not much of a problem. Anyways, any comments, questions on this? Okay, so again, just a quick reminder again, going back to soil sample, and we talk a lot about how we collect and what kind of analysis, but it's very important also how we handle those samples.
So if you look at the sulfur, we're volatilizing the sulfur because both of them are, basically one is going down, the second in cold storage. So
yeah, and that's kind of interesting. I don't know if this is. Well, 50%. Yes, but if you look at the scale, also this maybe was not a good example because it's it's just 3 parts per million sulfur there. So the drop is really like 1 part per million or something like that. There's a trend.
So you think that could be sampling error?
It could be, yes. Yeah, and so there's a trend, and this particular sample is not a good one. Brian did again with another set of samples with sulfur was more of an issue, and that was more clear in that case. So let's bring another point also that these kind of trends will vary a lot depending on the soil types, right? And so, for example, if we have a sandier soil with low organic matter, will you expect this difference to be that big for nitrogen? Maybe not so much, right? Because a lot of this is coming from organic matter. So if it is a sandy soil, really this difference may be less. What about if you are, further west and how dry it is? You're collecting that sample. How much moisture you have in that sample to begin with? Not much, right? It's already dry. And so in that case also, that's another component where this may not be a huge factor. And so the point with this is also that, again, and one of the questions that I got when we did this is, okay, I leave the sample for a week. How much more nitrogen can I expect to see? And that's a tough one to say because it's going to change a lot, depending on the moisture, depending on organic matter, and so on. However, the sample is not going to be accurate. That's what we know. So overall, again, submit your samples as soon as possible. If you are not going to do that, put it in the fridge. You can also frozen actually if you want to do that for nitrogen. That's not a problem. Or you can dry it, and that's stable. That's what we do in the lab. As soon as it gets to the lab, put it to the dryer, and at that point, it's stable. Okay.
What's the moisture content for optimal
Yes, and that's an excellent point. This was a sample that this sample I think we got about 15 to 18% moisture, so it was pretty high. It was pretty wet also.
Okay.
And so that's another point. Like I say again, Western Kansas with pretty dry soil, it's gonna be stable to begin with. Still, there's gonna be an effect, but I don't think it's gonna be as dramatic as this one. This is 100-pound difference in 2 weeks. So.
What about tissue samples? Do you think there's a limp? Or, I mean, you probably wouldn't see an increase in nitrogen.
No, in the case of tissue, and that's a very good point. I got that question quite a bit. Also, now we're talking about nitrates and corn and all of that. Tissue usually not a problem. The main thing with tissue is we want to get it dry as soon as possible, right? So put it in paper bags. As soon as that starts to dry, that's fine. That's pretty stable. We don't have that issue. So, good question. Okay. The other thing we wanted to discuss today also is, again, on this concept of nitrogen, economic optimum and agronomic optimum nitrogen, and a little bit on how that tied to nitrogen management and how we can be more efficient. And so that figure number 2 in page 2, and I showed this quite a bit last winter, just to kind of bring that point of the difference between agronomic optimum and economic. And this figure number 2 here is really, it's actually a regression that's coming from close to about 120 trials across Kansas. So it's a lot of noise here, but I'm only showing there the regression. And the 2 points that you have there is the agronomic maximum and the economic optimum. The agronomic maximum is basically at that point where you maximize yield, assuming essentially nitrogen fertilizer is free, right? So you're going after maximum yield, regardless of nitrogen costs. And the economic optimum is always going to be lower because nitrogen is not free, right? It's always going to be slightly lower. Now, the question is how much lower, and that's where we usually start to look at the price, right? Price of grain and price of fertilizer. And the question is, should we be cutting back nitrogen fertilizer to go after that economic optimum? And if so, for how much, right? And so that's the figure number 3 there, that you see multiple lines there, which those different lines are basically different scenarios of corn to nitrogen fertilizer prices. Okay, so if you have in the case of all the way from 12 to 5 is what I have there. If you have something like corn at 350 and 40 cents nitrogen, which that seems like years ago, you will have somewhere around that ratio of 7-8, right? Something like that. And so that's kind of a historical. And then what we have today is probably going to be more in that ratio of about 5, right? 5, if you think about $5 corn and $1 nitrogen. And so just if you compare those two, what I have there, again, if you look at the nitrogen rate, to maximize the return to that nitrogen fertilizer, which is the maximum point there, you're trying to go in after maximum return to investment. In the case of the expensive nitrogen case of 5, we need to cut back rates. The point is that, yes, we need to cut back rates a little bit. But if you see there, it's just about 10%. Okay, so if you typically put in 150, 180 pounds nitrogen, we're talking about 15 pounds of nitrogen that you need to cut back. Okay, so my point is that, it's not a lot. Okay, and the issue there is that, the reason for that is because corn is very, very responsive to nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, and so, if you cut it too much, obviously you're going to start affecting return to investment pretty significant. And so, again, just going after that economic optimum, I think obviously is what we want to do. But at the same time, you have to be careful not to be too aggressive and go to the other extreme that we're cutting to. So that's been a challenge. And again, I know it's a tough decision you guys have to make with the high fertilizer prices. But at the same time, grain prices are also good, right? We have this summer we have a field day, and I thought it was pretty interesting with the consultants. We have a lot of conversation on this, and many people say that maybe not so much the price, but the outlook for moisture was one of the main drivers for many people. And I don't know if some of you agree with that. It's kind of what you were seeing and what you were doing, and that makes sense, right? What is the risk, moving forward? So,
do you have any research along this line of what it costs you to over-fertilize by 20%. Because in a dryland situation, we don't know for sure what yield we're after, right? We all like 200, but it might only be 50.
Yeah.
So, but what, have you got any research that has that linear regression of what's it cost to over-fertilize corn by 10% or 20% as far as yield reduction?
We can get an idea from this same curve essentially. However, I think that has to do a little bit more about, in the case of dryland, and especially if we go west, it's really more about risk management situation, in my opinion. I think I will agree with this. I think in many cases in Western Kansas, we want to have a little bit of extra nitrogen if we have the good conditions, good moisture, right? And that's okay because we don't lose as much nitrogen in dryland, Western Kansas. Now, you don't want to do that if we go east because you can lose that nitrogen. If you're putting too much, you have leaching, it's gone, right? But if you're in Western Kansas, deep soils, yeah, it's nothing of that's happening. So you're going to have that extra nitrogen there. So that's a little bit different situation. And here we are kind of in between, I think, in that line. If we go east from here, we have the risk of losing. We go west, I think we can do that. We can add a little extra and keep some nitrogen in the profile if we have the condition. So it's a little bit more of a risk management, in my opinion, there. But it's valid. I like it for Western Kansas. I think it's a good option. How are we doing with time? I want to make sure we don't.
10 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So quickly, then we'll switch, and this is where I wanted to. One of the things that we've been doing, and Pedro started last year on this project, is to how we can do to maximize the return in terms of yield, applying the same amount of nitrogen. Okay, so what can we do in terms of placement, source, timing, to basically improve that efficiency? Because that's another thing that we need to think about. One aspect is the economic optimum, but other thing is that, okay, can I invest on maybe a fertilizer applicator that will basically improve my efficiency, get my money back for that investment in the long term, right? So that's, I think, one of the questions. So one project that he's been working on, and I'll let you, Pedro, describe a little bit what you have, but it's in page number 3 there, some of the data already.
So, hi all, how are you? My name is Pedro, as Professor Dorivar introduced me before. This is my first time talking with a crowd in English, so I am a little bit nervous, so please be nice with me. So yeah, I'm working with a nitrogen use efficiency study, working with corn and sorghum. And we have one location in here last year and one location in Belleville. And last year also we have 4 more locations across Kansas of corn and more of sorghum. In total, with this year, we are going to have 20 locations between corn and sorghum, trying to solve these issues that Professor Dorivar was explaining and talking a little bit before. One of them is you can see in the figure 4, where we are basically trying to see the corn or the crop response to the nitrogen fertilizer application. In this study, we are dividing the study in 2 parts. One part is going to focus on the nitrogen rate effect on the corn and sorghum yield and efficiency, and the nitrogen use efficiency of those crops. And the first part of that study is represented in this graph in the figure 4, where we can see the nitrogen fertilizer, the corn response on the nitrogen fertilizer. We can see that we found with this study an optimum nitrogen rate at 180 pounds per acre. This the source of nitrogen that we use in this part of the study was urea broadcast. So we have 6 different rates and 1 control without nitrogen application. So for that part, you can see the graph, the figure 4.
And this was here last year, right? Or was on the headquarters?
No, this was right here in Scandia.
In this field,
yeah.
okay.
So for the other part of the study, we are using 1 solid rate of 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, but we are using different sources of nitrogen, different timing of application, and different methods of application this nitrogen. So in total, we have 8 different ways of applying this 120 pounds of nitrogen to the crop, and we're comparing this with applying urea at the same rate, broadcasting urea at the same rate at planting. So you can see in figure 5 how we compare the the treatments with the different sources, the different methods, and the different timing of application with the urea. The urea in this graph is represented by the horizontal line, the black horizontal line that you can see in the figure 5. So all the treatments are represented by the bars. And you can see that in some treatments, for example, in UAN culture, Super U broadcast at B6, and UAN stream, we obtain more yield than the urea. We obtain also more yield in the anhydrous application injected in fall, the UAM stream at B6, the urea plus NDPT, which is a urease inhibitor, and the ESM broadcast. But statistically talking, we didn't find any difference in between, but we obtain more bushels. You can see that we obtain 5, 9, 10, 15 bushels more with these treatments. And in the treatment of UAN applying 2 by 2 at planting, we obtain a less yield than the urea broadcast at B6. So if you have some questions about this, please, I am free to.
Yeah. So
How is it incorporated? How is the urea incorporated with the? Did you run the pivot?
No, the urea was just broadcasted with hand. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
Didn't
broadcast.
run the pivot for a while. Then.
No.
Okay.
No, and that's a very good point. To obviously, in the case of irrigation system, we don't have here any treatments that show fertigation, right? And so that could be another option, right? What if you are doing, for example, fall or spring anhydrous with part of the nitrogen and then coming back and spoon feeding the rest of the nitrogen? I will expect that to be one of the most efficient systems in this scale here, okay? And so we don't have that in our treatments, but I just want to highlight that because if you have the capability of doing that with irrigation, then that would be a pretty efficient system.
And what is Super U broadcast?
Well, the Super U is a product that contains urease inhibitor and nitrification inhibitor both, and has 46 units of nitrogen. So 4600 as urea.
So it's basically urea treated with urease inhibitor and nitrification inhibitor.
At B6.
At B6. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, anyways, I think this is something to think about. One of the things with this is obviously, again, just like we talked earlier, I don't think there's really a recipe here. Some of these gonna be different depending on your soils, your management, if you're doing no-till, conventional tillage. So keep that in mind, right? But what we're trying to do with this project is really to look at, again, like Pedro mentioned, we have 20 sites so far, and basically to capture a little bit more of different soils, different environments, and be able to put a little bit more of an efficiency component in the recommendation. Okay? Comments, questions on this? Yes.
The UAN stream and the UAN culture, what stage of growth is that? Is that B6?
No, those were at
Oh,
planting.
those are at planting.
We have one treatment of UAN stream at B6, and we have one treatment of UAN
Yeah.
stream, but at planting.
At planting, yes. Okay. So one is V6 and the other one is at planting. The UAN culture injected always seems to be one that come back pretty efficient. In looking at other sites as well, and obviously in this case, you are injecting the nitrogen, right? So you probably don't have any volatilization, you don't have any tie-up problems, and so always tend to be a little bit on the more efficient side.
Is that every row or every other row?
This is every row, every other row, right here.
Every
The
other row.
applicator we have is every other row. So one culture for 2 rows.
So if I'm reading this right, if I'm 15 bushel better than anhydrous injected, you're looking at, or any of them that plus 30, you're taking $150 an acre to do it over spreading the urea. Is that
Well, again, this is looking at yields. Yeah. All of them has the same rate of application. All of them
Yeah.
have the same nitrogen.
and of course, a little bit difference in price.
Right.
But
Yep.
occasionally. So you can pay for a culture real fast.
Well, and that's a good. That's what exactly we're trying to do here is to put a little bit of that economics there. You're trying to make a decision in terms of that type of investment, because that's a tough one. If you're gonna pay for a culture, that's a big ticket item, right? So would that pay or not? But yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Not looking at much of the economics yet at this point, though. But
So that UAN culture, how far is that from the plant and how deep was it?
It's in the middle of the row. It's in the middle of the row, and it's probably injected really, I don't know, 2 or 3 inches, no more than that. So the main idea is really just to put it below the soil and avoid any contact with residue. Yes, and that's another one. And actually, that's the one we have here, which is UAN stream apply, which is also one of the efficient ones. One of the challenges with this is that we did a V6. And I believe the issue we have with those V6 was that we didn't put any nitrogen with the starter. And coming at V6 with all the nitrogen, I think we were a little bit suffering a little bit early on. And so this year, what we did is for anything that we're doing citrus, we make sure and we put something with the with the starter formulas, because you're coming back at V6, that corn is already suffered. Yeah. So that's a very, very important point. But I completely agree. Stream, between the rows, that's always come back as one of the top ones.
If you don't have many options when you get to the V6.
You don't have any option. Yeah, and so, but you don't need a lot of nitrogen, but you want to put a little bit at least with the starter. So that's what we start doing that.
One other, but you ran 2x2. You burnt the corn some.
No, but we have, and this is 120 pounds 2x2, right? And so it's pretty high. I didn't notice any. Have you looked at populations yet? On this?
No, yes, but
we collected plant population, but we haven't analyzed on that. I didn't see anything visual that you can tell that you burned the corn. I don't think so. But it is possible that there were some effect. And so I'm wondering that's why that 2x2 came back a little bit on the low side. So it's still pretty comparable to broadcast urea, though. I mean, it's
Correct.
remember that's essentially comparable to broadcast urea.
Do you have any way of applying that sort of like a strip till machine with a lot of the acres around here?
Absolutely, and that's another thing that we don't have here, and that would be a very efficient system also, right? If we're doing with a strip till application, again, that nitrogen, whether you're putting anhydrous, or if we're, for example, here we do strip till, we put UAN with a strip till, and that is obviously, again, very efficient system, injecting that nitrogen, avoiding losses that way. That would be one that will come, in my opinion, pretty high as well. But we are not able to test all the treatments, but I wish we had that one.
last year we have 15 treatments. This year we have 16.
Yeah.
So
So we added a little bit more, but it's becoming a little too big. So
How many replications do you make of each one of these treatments?
5 replications.
5? And check all the labels.
Yeah. So this is becoming a little big. How are we doing with time?
We're very much done.
Okay, so very good. So okay, thank you so much for the discussion. There are a few other things there in the back. You can look at it, and we can visit more also later if you want. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Dorivar. So I am Sarah Lancaster, Extension Weed Management Specialist. My topic this afternoon that we decided on is to talk a little bit about cover crops. So we're standing here near an experiment that Dorivar and I and some others are working on, funded graciously by the Kansas Soybean Commission to evaluate interactions of cover crops and fertility management and weed management in soybeans. And Dorivar was sure to tell me that he wants no credit for the weed management in this plots. So I do have to say that I am very much appreciative of our farm managers like Scott, who do allow me to come in and essentially trash a field so that we can collect good weed control data for you guys going forward. So Dorivar did say a couple of things also that I wanted to play off of a little bit. First, one of the things that he said was talking about how your fertility management is a little bit of a recipe, and it's kind of got to be your secret sauce for your farm. And I think that's something that's important to think about. You know, as weed management specialists, we talk a lot about product efficacy and things of that nature, but we've got to make sure that we're looking at programs that fit for your system. So, you know, don't feel compelled that there's a one-size-fits-all sort of program. Even for managing our most troublesome weeds, and even when we're talking about integrating things, non-chemical things like cover crops. There is no one-size-fits-all program here. And the other thing that Dorivar said then that I wanted to sort of play off of is he mentioned that this is a transition area. And you guys who live here know that, right? You go a little bit to the east, and we're very much in a higher rainfall region where cover crops are very common, and folks are really excited about how they might fit into their operation and how they can integrate cover and cattle and weed management and soil health benefits and all of these things. But you go a little bit farther west, and sometimes I'm afraid I might get rotten tomatoes or something a little more solid thrown at me when I say the word cover crops in front of an audience, right? So this is an interesting geography to work in, and we're grateful for this opportunity. So I wanted to talk a little bit. We've probably got, 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes at this point, Scott. I'll talk a little bit about just some of the principles of choosing cover crops for weed suppression, and then we are just starting to collect data on this project, so unfortunately don't have any fun information to share from this particular field, but I do have a master's student, Lily Watuszewski. Say that one 3 times fast, and you're ahead of me. But Lily's been working on some projects in cooperation with Craig and some of our other agents to look at how cover crops and grazing work together to affect weed management, and also she has taken the lead on a study that we have that was funded by the United Soybean Board in cooperation with 8 other weed scientists to look at the effects or interactions of planting dates and residual herbicides and termination timing on soybean weed control. So that's where we're kind of going to go for the next few minutes. So, cover crops for weed suppression. Academics like to talk about a lot of different things related to cover crops for weed management. Sometimes we talk about the fact that they can change the surface where those weed seeds are germinating. They'll change the properties of the soil. They can compete with weeds to take nutrients away from weeds that might come up and interfere with our cash crops. And then the third thing that we talk about cover crops doing is that some of them are allelopathic. Very difficult thing to actually quantify in the field. Is it real? Yes. Will we, in my lifetime, probably have a solid answer for how much does that allelopathy play into weed suppression by cover crops? I'll be very impressed. Okay. There are some studies out there that have looked at that and tried to tease it apart, but as you guys know, plants respond to the environment, right? And the environment in which that plant is growing has such a tremendous impact on the allelochemicals that plant is producing that it's very difficult to quantify that effect. So, as we look at our plots here, what's the number one weed that you see? Volunteer corn. I would say that's pretty representative of a lot of Kansas fields, unfortunately. We have kind of gotten away from some of the things maybe that are very effective tools for volunteer corn, and we also know, as with most weeds, that application timing in terms of the height of the volunteer corn is very important for that. What's the number 2 weed that you guys see in those plots? Palmer. And then, if you look hard, what's the number 3 weed that you see in those plots? You didn't know you had a quiz this afternoon. Sorry. I should have prepped you. See a third one out there? Foxtail's out there. That's not the one I was fishing for, but you are correct. Yeah, we talked about the corn. Sorry, thanks for coming. Yeah. Velvet leaf. Okay? There's some velvet leaf out there in some of those plots. And so the point that I wanted to make with that little exercise, guys, is that we know that cover crops are good for suppressing some weeds and less good for suppressing other weeds. Quite honestly, covers can be pretty effective at suppressing pigweeds. Okay? There's quite a bit of data, some of it generated here in Kansas, that say that when you use cover crops, you delay the time it takes, or you lengthen the time it takes for our Palmer amaranth and our water hemp to reach that critical 4-inch growth stage, right? If you read herbicide labels, a lot of them talk about 3 to 4 inch weeds is our target height. So when we use covers, we can buy ourselves some time. Quite honestly, guys, that is the most consistent effect that you're going to see from using covers year in and year out. And I'm sorry I'm dancing because I don't want to get wet.
I'll adjust.
Okay. So they're pretty good for pigweeds. The other thing that we need to think about in terms of selecting covers and weed species and getting that to sync and to match is the timing of emergence of our weeds. Okay? I sometimes joke with folks that weed scientists my age are Roundup babies, and we kind of forgot all the weed ecology that we learned in class when we were undergrads. But going back to remembering the basics of weed ecology and when those weeds are most likely to emerge is super important as you're thinking about integrating cover crops into an operation for weed management. We need to make sure that those covers are there and growing and healthy before our weeds start to emerge if we want to get maximum effectiveness. If we don't have good ground cover before those weeds start to emerge, we're not going to see the weed suppression that we might hope to see from our cover crops. And so that brings me to another question that folks sometimes have. Quite honestly, guys, there's not a ton of great data on this question, but I had a graduate student several years ago go through the literature that was available at the time and try to answer the question, how does species diversity in our cover crop mix affect weed suppression? Okay. Now, I'm not talking about soil health benefits and all of the other things that folks might be interested in discussing when they discuss cover crops. I'm talking about weed suppression, okay? The number of species that you have doesn't really matter as much as just how much biomass you're able to generate, okay? So you want something that you know is going to establish quickly, establish vigorously, and produce a lot of biomass. That's kind of the ticket there. Okay, do you guys have questions about that? I think we'll skip some of the other comments about just kind of principles and get on to some more interesting data. Is that good? Okay. So, the first thing I'd like to bring to your attention, if I can find the right sheet here, is, as we think about the economics of integrating cover crops, they're really not making us a direct income in and of themselves, right? And so where cover crops often have a fit is where folks either have cattle or have access to someone with cattle that will utilize those covers as forage. And so Lily set out to try to answer some of these questions of how much cover crop biomass can we remove through grazing before we start to see a reduction in the weed suppression. In short, guys, the answer is across 5 locations where she was doing this research, it didn't matter how long the cattle grazed. It did not change the weed suppression in terms of the winter annuals and the early season summer annuals that she was measuring in her studies. So that's good news, right? So we can utilize that forage pretty extensively.
Does that include spring grazing also?
So she started grazing, she started grazing like around Thanksgiving, right? Because Craig, your location, I think, was the first one we put out. So that was around Thanksgiving. And you guys recall the fall, right? We didn't get a ton of cover crop growth at any of her locations this fall. She grazed all the way through, goodness, she just brought the cages home here about the end of the semester in May. The exclusion cages. So she was grazing through the spring at some of her locations. There was one location where she did see some differences, and that was a location actually in Wamego, where they had a pretty heavy infestation of foxtail and palmer. And she did see some differences in her grazing, and how grazing timing and grazing duration affected the weed suppression of the palmer. And so basically, as you might expect, the longer the cattle were allowed to graze, the more palmer amaranth she had in those plots. Okay, so if we're just talking winter annuals and some of those early season less aggressive species, there were no differences. But in her location where she had the most heavy palmer amaranth pressure, by the time she got to those spring removal dates, she did start to see a reduction in the palmer amaranth suppression. So, and again, that comes down to ecology, right? Timing that. When are you going to put those cattle out there to really take down that forage height? One thing we didn't do was look closely at regrowth, right? So if we had taken that biomass down to 2 or 3 inches and then let it regrow before the palmer started to germinate and emerge, what would we see? That's a question he didn't answer. So yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Any other questions about that study or comments, thoughts?
If you leave the cattle out there past like mid-February, then you run into compaction problems in the spring, we've noticed.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother area that I have not tried to measure.
Either compaction or weeds, huh?
Depends on when it rains, right?
Exactly.
Depends on when it rains. I grew up in country where we graze a lot of corn stalks, and so you have to fight that battle a little bit anyway. But interestingly, there's some data, I think, out of Nebraska, Mary Jerneski's lab, where she was looking at grazing stalks and compaction. She claims, because we had some of this conversation around cover crops early on with Mary, she claims that there was no difference.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not my data. I don't know. So the third thing I wanted to talk about here, looks like we've got maybe 10 minutes or so, Scott, sound about right? Is a study that, really I think is a pretty interesting study, looking at a lot of interactions in terms of using cover crops to manage specifically pigweeds is what we were looking at. What we were most interested in, managing pigweeds in soybeans. So the objective was to evaluate the impact of planting green or not, so planting into standing cereal rye, standing cereal rye, or terminating that cereal rye about 2 weeks ahead of planting. Okay, so that was one set of comparisons, was the termination timing relative to planting. Another set of comparisons that we looked at was planting date, right? A lot of folks, my understanding is that a lot of folks in this area are moving their soybean planting dates up ahead of their corn for a lot of good reasons, but we just don't have a lot of good weed control data on using herbicides in that system with those planting dates that are earlier than what we've conventionally used. So looking at an earlier planting date and then a more, quote, normal planting date. And then the third piece to this was looking at including Zidua or no Zidua in that burn down application, because one of the questions that we get is, how does that cover crop residue interact with our residual herbicides that we might want to apply at the time of that burn down application? So we're looking at some of those questions as well. So things to think, okay, so the other 9 locations, guys, we had studies as far northwest as Fargo, and as far east as Pennsylvania, and as far southeast as Kentucky. So we covered a pretty good chunk of geography with those different sites. So some things to think about, the cover crop biomass at termination. As you might expect, the most biomass occurred with the planting green with the late planting date, right? That cereal rye obviously had more time to grow in that situation. I will tell you, one of the things that we ran into in our study at Rossville, we had voles, especially in those later planted treatments where we had more biomass for those critters to go after and to burrow in. So we talked about biomass. Other things to look at here, thinking about pigweed plants per meter squared. The greatest number of pigweed plants per meter squared were found in either the no cover or the early termination with the early planted soybeans. So early planted, early cover, or no cover or early termination. So again, the least amount of that cereal rye biomass would have been present in those plots. The least amount of water hemp were found really in the green planted green planted treatments that included the Zidua, regardless of the planting date. Okay, so if we had Zidua with the planting green, whether we planted early or late, we had fewer palmer amarants coming up in those plots. Okay, so over all the site locations, planting early and planting green with the pre was actually the lowest, averaged over those 11 sites. Okay. All right, so thinking about our Kansas-specific data, and these data were collected over at the Kansas River Valley Experiment Field in Rossville. So different environment, very sandy soils over there, right, Rodrigo? In that situation. So similarly, we had the most Palmer amaranth in the early planted soybeans that had no cover, okay, and we had the fewest in the planting green treatments. Now the big question there is yield, right? So we want to know, how do these things yield? So across the board, across all the locations, yield was greatest with the early planted soybeans. Okay, so that lines up with what the data from the agronomist is telling us. That lines up with what folks are doing in the field is telling us. In Kansas, that trend continued as well. We did see a little bit of a yield reduction with those green planted treatments, especially in relative to the other early planted soybean treatments. So there are some interactions there in terms probably of things like soil conditions. I know the first year we put this study out that when we planted the early treatments, it was like 60 degrees that day. The ground temperature was just barely suitable, and we had a really cold snap. So, just adjusting for those types of things is important. The last piece of that study that we're still waiting on the lab results for is looking at how much pyroxasulfone or how much zidua is in the soil from those various treatments. So I'll be excited to share that data with folks, hopefully maybe this winter. So, all right. I think we did it. We've got about 5 minutes left. What questions or comments do you guys have about any of those studies or anything else weed related? Any questions that we can look at before I pass the mic off to Rodrigo?
Are you applying the herbicide before or after you plant?
So in all of my research plots, we plant and then we spray. So all of my data sets will be generated that way.
What rate of zidua are you using per acre?
Oh, snap. That is not on here, and I do not remember. I am sorry.
Are you using just zidua SC?
So it was just Zidua SC. We put it on along with Roundup and Liberty. So we had the burned down herbicides, and then Zidua was the only residual we put out. So
Only residual.
at the pre-timing. Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
What was the cover crop planted on? Was it
Out here?
cereal rye or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I also tease a little bit that rye should be a 4-letter word in some places. This was oats. This was oat. So, yep.
So relating to that,
Yeah,
cereal rye has the largest biomass of any cereal grain.
absolutely.
So say you don't want cereal rye potentially in a wheat field, and you use wheat or oats, which significantly is less biomass. Percentage-wise, how much less weed control are you going to get on pigweed?
You know,
Because wheat would be like, what, maybe 60% of the biomass?
I think that depends on your planting density, your planting date, and conditions around planting, and then when you decide to terminate, right? If you're really concerned about biomass, you can let that wheat go a little bit longer and try to achieve some more biomass, or increase, bin run wheat is probably cheaper than you can go buy Elbon cereal rye, right? So you can maybe have some wiggle room there to up your seeding rates and make sure you get that good biomass there and still remain friends with your neighbors.
But are you looking at, what, 50% the weed control?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Mike, of a data set where folks have looked at that. And I can think of data sets where they looked at different cereal rye varieties. But I can't, let me see if I can. There was a meta-analysis that was done a while back where they pulled all the different treatments or data that were available. And I mean, it's not a 1-to-1 relationship in terms of that slope of as the biomass decreased, the weed control decreased, but it's not far off. So does that help?
Yeah,
that's
if you're
a little bit of
50% of the biomass, 50%
Yeah.
of the weed control.
Not quite 1-to-1, just a little shy. So yep. No, that's a very good question. Thank
Do
you.
you have any studies that had radish and turnips?
I have not played with looking at how radish or turnip affect weed suppression. I think that Peter and Deanne probably have some data looking at, just general agronomics with those systems.
And it's assisting the compaction problem.
It is, and I know a lot of folks like those specifically for that purpose. But again, it's biomass. As long as you've got enough of that winter cereal in there to get good ground cover that's going to stick around. That's one of the things. If you go walk these plots, you can still see the oat residue that was out there. Even though did those oats completely winter kill, Dorivar, or did you guys spray them out?
Well, those were planted in March.
They were spring planted. Okay.
And so I was impressed how much biomass still had it. It was pretty dry, obviously, early on.
Yeah. So, yeah, good questions. Good questions. Thanks. All right, Rodrigo.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah and Dorivar. It's been a good exercise here. My name is Rodrigo Onofre. I'm a K-State row crop specialist covering the disease side. And I like this exercise here today where we're covering all the bases, right? The fertility, the weed, and now a little bit of the disease side. Before I get into the treatments and the trials that we have here in Roseville, it's a little bit wet outside, and I thought I'll go and collect some of the leaves and things that we're seeing and kind of reflects on this area too. Problems and issues that we kind of see every year, right? Gray leaf spot, one of the main problems that we would worry about spraying a fungicide or not, and solder rust, right? So those are the two big yield robbers for us in this region regarding foliar application. Here, and I'm gonna pass those leaves to you guys. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the gray leaf spot. There you go. Oh, can I have that one back?
It's got more problems.
Great. Yeah, there we go. This one, you can pass this on to you. So, gray leaf spot, as you guys are gonna see in there, survives in crop residue, and what it means to us is it will survive from one year to the next year. By doing that, we will see this disease coming from the bottom up, right? So when you're out there scouting and looking for disease, gray leaf spot, we'll start on that lower canop and will make its way into the ear leaf. And when it hits the ear leaf, that's the point when we start seeing yield reduction of 10-5% depending on the disease pressure. This year, okay, let's just step back right now, right? So think about how this season's been going. We started quite wet in that early on planting. A lot of folks got delayed on that planting date and got mixed with the beans and corn. So a lot of people had problems with some of those seedling blights early on in the season. As soon as that dries out, not much happened on the dry side, on the non-irrigated corn, right? However, on the irrigated corn, it's the one that we're seeing most of the problems this year. Solder rust came in late. I don't think it's gonna be a big problem for us this season. I'm seeing a couple of spots here and there. I was reported late July, which is a little bit late for us. I would say late planted corn, susceptible hybrids, those are the ones that we should be worried about it. However, at this point, we're past application, I would say point. Solder rust, we're applying fungicides between VT to R3 to be a little bit on the late side. However, we're shooting to that VT R1 application, right? And then back to gray leaf spot. Gray leaf spot, it can show up early as V10 and will make its way on that VT R1 into the ear leaf. So you guys just saw gray leaf spot, right? However, there's another disease that we do see in this area, which is called bacterial leaf streak. This disease, it looks a lot like gray leaf spot. However, it's a bacteria. And if we have this disease in the field and we spray a fungicide, it's not gonna do any good, right? One way to differentiate these two diseases, gray leaf spot and bacterial leaf streak, is just when we look at the lesion, gray leaf spot will have very narrow edge. It's kind of like a rectangular spot in the field, right? And the center, it's pretty gray, as the name would say, and you don't see light going through. Bacterial leaf streak, when we put it against the light, we're gonna see that the light kind of passes through it. It's not as dark as would be in the gray leaf spot. And the other thing with bacteria is the edge of this lesion is more like a wavy aspect to it. It's not that clear rectangular that we see for gray leaf spot. I'm gonna pass this one. That's the bacteria. Now, two things. One thing that I'm starting to see a little bit more, but still I haven't found a field that was, I would say, in the economic threshold to put a fungicide to control this disease. It's called northern corn leaf blight. As you can see, it's a pretty bigger lesion in comparison with gray leaf spot. This disease is also called cigar shape for some reason, and but it's this big elliptical lesion, a lot bigger than gray leaf spot. It's kind of like hard to miss it if you. I'm gonna pass this around here. If you see it in the field, let's see, I think I have another one. Oh yeah, right on the tip of this. Right on the tip of this leaf here, we have a lesion there. Southern states, they do have a lot more problems with northern corn leaf blight. So far, as I said, I haven't found a field here in Kansas that we should have sprayed something for northern corn. Something that I'm seeing at this moment on the eastern part of the state under irrigation as well, it's a diploded ear rot. I think it's we got some moisture, and with the irrigation at that tasseling pollination time, and I think that's leading us with a more high incidence of diploded ear rot, right? Those ear rots, there are a few of them. When we think about ear rot, it's kind of that same word that we have in wheat with FHB, right? Some of those will produce toxins. You get discount in the elevator, can be toxic to livestock, cause some vomiting toxin, as we heard it in wheat. We do have some of those in corn as well. So just something to be on the lookout. And Aspergillus, it's one of them that we do see, and especially on the dry land this year, although dry land corn is suffering a lot with the drought, it's one of the diseases that we'll expect to see as we go forward on the drying down now, right? And going down into the season now, right, we'll start thinking about the stalk rots. If you're walking to your field, seeing stalk rot lodging, right? Those fields, we need to harvest them first so we get that corn, that grain out of the field before we start seeing lodging. If we start seeing lodging and you get a wind or a storm through it, the damage could be a lot worse just to get that grain out of the field. So that would be the corn side. My student Madison Kessler is here. She started early this summer. So it's her first semester at K-State. I'll let her cover her project with soybean SDS.
Thank you. So I'm Madison. I'm focusing on sudden death syndrome of soybean. So sudden death syndrome is a soil-borne disease, and it's caused by the pathogen Fusarium vigiliforme. This infection begins shortly after planting, and it produces a toxin that goes into the leaves and causes the above ground symptoms. So I have some leaves for y'all, just so you can observe these symptoms. I'll pass them around, but you can see in there's intraveinal chlorosis, which is the yellowing, and then intraveinal necrosis. If you want to pass those around. Yeah. So that's what you see above ground, and then if you were to take one of these plants out, the root is also going to have some necrosis going on. So this is a problem because it does cause yield loss. But this is mainly observed in fields that have the soybeans planted in wet and cool conditions, followed by wet conditions after flowering. And then one way that we like to manage SDS is with seed treatments, which is a experiment that we have going on in Rossville and Topeka. So this is actually the first year we're doing this experiment. It's a multi-state experiment. We have 15 locations across the Midwest, as well as one in Canada. And so at each location, we have different soybean varieties, which we determined using the maturity groups for the region, so that there's a susceptible soybean and then a resistant, thank you. And so at our location in Topeka and Rossville, we had 2 cultivars and then 8 seed treatments. We also infested the soil with the SDS pathogen so that we will hopefully have disease present and be able to determine the seed treatment impact on SDS. And this is just a really important disease for us in Kansas because in 16 counties we have confirmed cases of SDS, and this is mainly in the north central part of the state, which is where most of the soybeans are produced. We are also looking for fields with SDS, so if you or you know anyone, please reach out to us. We're trying to collect some samples.
Yeah, thank you. Of course. Yeah, so this project that Madsen is working on, it's funded by the North Central Soybean Commission, research program. Damon Smith in Wisconsin is the lead on this project. We're grateful to be part of it, and I think there's a lot of power that the multi-state projects bring to us, right? Not just looking at Kansas, but also across the region. So thank you so much, Madsen. And on the soybean side still, we have a project with the United Soybean Board where we provide free soybean cyst nematode sampling. Soybean cyst nematode, we have seen it as soybeans moving towards west, the soybean cyst nematode is also following that trend, right? And what we're seeing is that the count is now that we're low. 10 years ago, on the survey that they did, they're starting to shift and increase the prevalence of this nematode in the field. We have yield reduction reports here in Kansas up to 40 bushels caused by this nematode. It's not usual, but it can be a very significant impact in the fields. The best way to control the soybean cyst nematode is starting with sampling. It's like sampling for fertility. 0 to 6, 10 to 20 cores per field, and send that to our lab and we'll process that. And then get back with the results to you, right? So just make sure that you take advantage of this free soybean cyst sampling that we're doing right now. So just send us a sample, right? Now, back to the corn. We have 2 trials here in Scandia. I wish we could go there today, but it's quite wet, so we're just gonna stay right here and we'll talk about some of the products and what we're doing, right? Since I started, I know a lot of folks are spraying for disease in Kansas and spraying sometimes on that prophylactic application and trying to see if there's any yield benefit. So we have trials here in Scandia and also in Topeka and Roseville looking into corn efficacy for fungicide trials. And in the fungicide trials, we're looking to the foliar treatments, but also into the In-Furrow treatments. There is one product, you all heard about it, Xyway being applied, use it early on that 2x2 application, right? Dorivar was mentioned putting the nitrogen early on. So on the disease side, we're testing putting that fungicide early on in the season, just to see if that will have any impact in controlling some of the disease, right? From the trials that we did last year, we saw that just by putting that fungicide early on, we got about 50% disease reduction on that ear leaf, less than the no-treated control. But also we're seeing on those efficacy trials, you know, there's all the, I would say, the top-notch products right there just for us to test. What I did see last year is where there was no disease, we did not see any yield increase from those fungicide applications. We had the same treatments in Manhattan at the North Farm, just by the stadium, and we also had that trial in Roseville. In Roseville, we did have some yield benefit from those fungicide applications, but we did have quite a bit of disease. So we did see some response from those fungicides. And here, the signs are gonna be up. It's just on that cornfield right there. If you guys wanna see it tomorrow or whatever you guys get a chance to see the treatments, they're gonna be there. And on the second half of the field, we have a trial with Dorivar where we're looking into the combination of fungicide and nitrogen. Like you're presenting before here on that nitrogen applied at V6, what we did see, again, in the presence of disease, okay, when we apply nitrogen followed by a fungicide, either at V10 or at VT, we did see increment in yield responding towards that that fungicide application, right? So not just the nitrogen, but also when we did the combination, we had a higher yield response to that treatment. We're doing this trial we did it here in 2 locations. Last year, we're doing 1 location this year here in Kansas. But also we have 2 locations in Iowa with Allison Robertson there, where she's looking at 2 locations and doing the same treatments. What we're seeing is that from last year, it was just 2 locations, one in Manhattan, one in Rossville. Again, where we had disease pressure, we did have a response from it, that combination of fungicide and nitrogen. However, in Manhattan, where we didn't have much disease, was pretty much beautiful corn, there was no response, and the yield was pretty high, above 200 bushels. Across all the treatments were all about the same. So that's something that we're looking into, seeing where now last year we had 1 product, this year we have 2 products, where just to see if there's any difference, better disease control, and look into those aspects too. Guys have any questions about it, or seeing any disease or anything in the fields besides drought these days? Are you guys spray anything for corn or soybeans? And when are you guys spraying a VT in corn, R1, and soybeans R3? Yeah. So on the soybean side, this field here will be a foliar trial where we're going to be looking into 11 different treatments applied at R3. There's not much disease. I would say barely no disease, pretty much. But we'll apply the treatments and see what happens regarding yield and seed quality at the end. Because I know seed quality can be a big problem, especially on that late season if we start having some rains and some bad weather at harvesting point. So those are kind of the things that we're looking into at this point. Yeah, so thank you so much. You guys have any other questions or want to see some corn? I'm willing to go. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. If this is what it takes to make it rain, I guess so be it. Really wasn't planning to need a jacket in August, but hey, here we are. One last thing on the field end, I'd like to thank Mike Larson, our support staff individual. He couldn't be here today, and also our summer student worker, Daniel Reiki. He's already gone back to campus for the fall, but I'd really like to thank those guys for all the help they've done around here with the fields. I think that's it for the program. Seemed like we had some good discussions. I think the speakers will be around if anyone else has other questions. So.